There are two problems in the world, and I think they can be solved with a single solution. The first problem is Legos. A few weeks ago, we talked about how Lego could benefit by breaking away from their licensed products and find new uses for old models. The second problem has to do with Dungeons and Dragons and the TTRPG landscape. Attempts have been made over the years to make simplified versions of a TTRPG, both to speed up play and introduce new players to the hobby. But the prospect of picking one up for the first time can still be daunting. For all the work that's been done, be it with board games like HeroQuest or Gloomhaven, or by video games introducing people to the concepts of player classes, dungeon diving, leveling up, and getting loot. While these things are great in their own right, they contain only a portion of what a TTRPG has to offer. They introduce concepts, but not the whole experience. The on-ramp is still intimidating, the learning curve steep. What we need is something that contains the entire TTRPG experience. Something with classes, levels, role-playing, a dungeon master, and all the rest. But with a minimal learning curve in an environment that is safe, familiar, and fun. One that invites a new generation into an old hobby. What we need is Lego. Now, people have been using Lego to play D&D for decades, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Sure, people can and do use Lego to make maps and dungeon layouts, to use their minifigs in place of their characters and all the rest. But what I'm talking about is an RPG designed from the ground up, by Lego, for Lego. This would be aimed specifically at kids to young adults, probably starting at around age 8 and topping out at age 14. It would introduce all aspects of the hobby to kids and prepare them to move on to bigger or more abstract RPGs by the time they were finished. It's what the community might call baby's first RPG, but one which I think kids could have a lot of fun with, and parents could use to teach a hobby they love to their children. The key is to make the game as far from intimidating as possible. I love D&D's rulebooks, the artwork, the way they're designed, but let's face it, they're big, expensive, and can be absolutely bewildering to anyone wanting to learn the hobby. My friends and I talked about getting into D&D when we were in middle school, but we never did because we didn't know where to start. We didn't know how to play, and the prospect of spending $60 on books we weren't even sure we needed was too daunting a prospect for a handful of broke teenagers. I regret that now because I have the benefit of experience. I know how delightful things like D&D and Pathfinder can be and how fun they are to play. But I only know that because of hindsight. In a pre-YouTube world, there just weren't that many examples of play. And while those examples do exist now, how many people know they're out there? How many people can use that as a place to start? As popular as things like Stranger Things and Critical Role are, they aren't Lego popular. They aren't see it on a shelf at Walmart and take it home popular. So I'm thinking the base version of this product comes in one box and has one book. That box would have everything a group of players would need to get started, and though the book would be written with the intention that an adult would be teaching the players how to play and would DM the adventure, it would be written in such a way that an enterprising or smart kid could work their way through it. This may sound lofty, but it's actually how a lot of board game instructions are written, using simple, clear language to explain the rules, provide examples of play, and stay away from lofty, abstract, or poetic language. So now that we've got the box at home, how would the game actually work? How could we set it apart from not only Dungeons and Dragons, but other games that have attempted to do the same? I think the key here, and this is true when designing lots of things for children, is not to make the experience lesser, but to make it simpler. We don't want to take away the concepts of classes or leveling up or loot or any of the other core aspects of playing a TTRPG. What we want is to capture the entire experience and what's important to that experience while simplifying them so that a child or someone with little experience can still understand them and choose between their options. Let's look at classes, for example. Dungeons & Dragons has 9 of them, with subclasses, backgrounds, and a mess of other stuff that's designed to help a player craft the exact character they want to play to capture their fantasy. They can get away with that largely because new players are just gonna pick a class that sounds familiar and hope for the best. And experienced players are familiar with the trade-offs that each class presents. But to a child or a new player, it can still be pretty intimidating. All of the options, stats, modifiers, it's enough to make someone give up or tell themselves they'll come back to it later. And we all know how that goes. Well, picking a character from a list and going through the process of adding modifiers and bonuses is possible. It hardly leaves a new player with a thorough understanding of their class or how to effectively play it. So what if instead of 9 classes, we had 4? Fighter, Rogue, Cleric, Wizard. Archetypes everyone is familiar with that appear across many games, stories, and other mediums. We don't have to worry about ancestries because minifigs are all the same and can similarly discard backgrounds and other modifiers. Players still have a choice. They are still being introduced to the concept of a player class, but in a setting and with options that are already familiar to them, and few enough that they aren't overwhelmed. We keep a core tenet of the TTRPG experience, but simplify it to a child's level. Like in our wargame example, movement can be done by pips instead of measurement, in the same way that Dungeons & Dragons largely simplifies feet of movement into 5-foot squares. Units and monsters would be given a maximum number of pips they can move, with a change of elevation being equal to, say, 3 pips of movement. Combat is where things get a bit trickier. I think we still need the basic forms of combat we see in things like D&D. Melee attacks, range attacks, and of course, spells. But how they work could use some refinement. Melee attacks should be the simplest thing in the world. I walk up to a monster, I hit it with the sharp thing. But as gamers, we love our complexity. So there's a roll to hit, an armor class, rolling for damage, and all the rest. So I pose to you this question. What about AC is fun? Is missing fun? It's fun when the monster misses. I roll a 12, ha, you miss. But when we miss, it's not that fun. Especially for kids, especially for a new experience we are trying to learn. D&D solves this with bonus actions and abilities and a whole bunch of other stuff to keep the player feeling like they're contributing. But remember, we're trying to keep things simple. We don't want new players having to remember all of this stuff, much less understand it. So what if we just got rid of it? What if melee attacks hit automatically and the balancing comes in the form of rolling for damage? Sometimes you do 1 damage, sometimes you do 6 damage. But if all you want to do is show up and hit stuff with an axe, we've got a product for you. It's called the Xbox 360, Fighter. The fantasy of this product isn't memorizing or checking AC, and it isn't missing. It's parents sitting around the dining room table and introducing a beloved hobby to the next generation. We don't want parents to spend their evening consoling a kid who keeps missing. We want parents cheering their children on as they slay monsters to impart the fun and the joy of their hobby. So maybe you just don't miss, ever. Maybe we get rid of it and save the complexity for when those kids are older and ready to move on to more advanced games. And if you really, really want missing in, I'd recommend dropping the concept of AC and using something like Axis and Allies system. Instead of rolling to hit, players would roll for damage and miss on certain numbers. Swords could miss on a 1 or 3, bows miss on 2s and 4s, and so on. This gives a lot of flexibility when dialing in the balance of certain weapons, reduces the overall number of dice to roll, and speeds up players' turns. All of this would of course work the same way for monsters and players alike. Okay, so that covers melee, but what about ranged? What if we combined those two ideas? Let's say that melee weapons always hit, never miss. Fighters are all killer, no filler, they just show up and hit things. But what if ranged attacks then borrow that Axis and Allies system? So a dagger is a D2 and never misses. A sword is 1d6 and an axe is 1d8. This makes it so the melee class is always in combat, softly teaching our new players about how to tank without making it explicit. And it means that they never miss, so they always feel like they're contributing. But their weapons are swingier. Get it? Melee? Swing? Never mind. Sometimes they do 1 damage, and sometimes they do 8 damage. We save our Axis and Ally system for the rogue class, for players that want something more advanced or engaging. So a javelin might do 1d8, but always misses on a 1, 2, or 3. There's greater risk, but hitting means consistently more damage, as to where a bow could do 1d6, missing on 1s and 6s. More likely to hit, but less damage overall. This gives our two classes a clear trade-off in effectiveness and style, all while keeping the complexity relatively low and easy to understand. And then we get to spells, the thing every RPG designer has struggled with, from the original Dungeons & Dragons to Final Fantasy and Pokemon. Each have logical, understandable systems. Final Fantasy tends to just give you mana, a bank of points that you withdraw from, with different spells costing different amounts. Pokemon drops the mana but limits each attack to a certain number of uses, with more powerful attacks having less chances to use them. And then there's D&D with its Vancian nonsense. Now, don't get me wrong, Vancian magic has its benefits and can certainly be narrative. But how often is it fun? Personally, I don't really mind the concept of spell slots. I actually think they're a pretty clever way to keep track of uses, certainly easier than mana points or uses for each specific ability. It's more the spell memorization I have a problem with, especially when we're trying to design a product aimed at kids or new players. So what if we keep the idea of spell slots and get rid of everything else? To make it easier on players, clerics and wizards will work exactly the same in terms of spellcasting, but will have magic suited to different purposes. Clerics for healing and support, wizards for setting things on fire. We take our spell slot system and we simplify it as much as possible while retaining the core idea. We can use the Lego themselves to track that spellcasting. Simply make a little board and use pips or gems to track how many spell uses someone has at a given spot. So if I cast a level 1 spell, I remove one of my level 1 spell pips, giving me a visual indication of exactly what I have left. We can even squeeze a little more out of this by saying that a level 3 spell is worth a 2 and a 1. Meaning a player could burn a level 3 pip to use a level 2 and level 1 spell in the same turn, or vice versa, burning a level 2 and a level 1 pip to get an extra casting out of a level 3. Just like with AC, I'd drop the concept of missing or saving throws entirely. Just let the people use their cool stuff. This teaches the new players resource management, math, and a whole bunch of other important life skills, all while still making the classes feel unique and not overburdening the player with unneeded complexity. So now we have a core idea and have a loose understanding of how class, movement, and combat would work within the game. But how would it work as a product? That part is easy. Other industries have largely already done the work for us. The rulebook could be sold separately as with D&D for those that already own a ton of Lego, or it could be sold in a beginner's box including everything you need as D&D already does. It would include the book, a dungeon playset, a minifig for each class, and a few monsters to get the players started. For the dungeons, Lego has a few options. They could host map instructions on their website, giving players the layout of a dungeon, but expecting them to build the walls and such themselves, with the DM populating it before play begins. Or they could sell specific dungeon playsets, old castles, villages, forests, anything the community needs for their adventures. And of course, LEGO could sell standalone figures and monsters, and could put out additional books for new adventures, classes, or environments to expand what's available to the players. I'm sure there are many people who are going to write this off as not being needed, saying that kids should stick to Minecraft or that things shouldn't be dumbed down for babies. But let's face it, those people are jerks. Role-playing games in all their variants, all their versions, are a really fun hobby that has the potential to bring happiness to a lot of lives. One of the reasons I regret my friends and I not getting into RPGs was that while the upfront cost was prohibitive, it's actually a really cheap hobby once you cross the initial threshold. These days, between the cost of computers, the internet, video games, and the like, it's hard for less fortunate kids to find hobbies they can play with their friends over and over again. RPGs, regardless of the actual flavor they come in, can give kids hours and hours of fun for little upfront cost. So let's find ways to bring more of them into the hobby. Ways that don't ask them to get good or make the steep climb up to our level, but instead approach them at their level where they are. They get a lifetime of happy memories, and we get a new generation breathing fresh air into an increasingly stale hobby. LEGO makes a ton of money, and parents get something fun and wholesome to do with their kids on a rainy Saturday night. Everyone wins. I'm Michael Aguero. Thanks for watching. I don't just think about game design, I write books. If you want to support the channel, you can pick them up on Amazon Kindle or Google Play. If you want to keep up to date with what I'm working on or where my head is currently at, you can follow me on Twitter. And if you like the video, you can click all the buttons and subscribe to all the things. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.